welcome to Author Nation Interviews. We are in season 4. I'm so excited. And today, our very first episode, we're diving into myth and memoir, where we will be exploring using myth as the backbone of your memoir. And I think it actually can be applied to any nonfiction author. I'm your host, Melody Ann, and I'm here to guide you toward actionable insights and strategies that will help you not only write with purpose, but also connect with your readers on a deeper level. At Author Nation, we're committed to equipping you with the tools, inspiration, and community you need to succeed as a nonfiction author. So you can visit authornation.online to access a treasure trove of resources from expert writing advice to cutting-edge marketing techniques. So whether you're sipping your morning coffee or winding down after a long day, settle in as we explore how myth and memoir can transform your writing and your ability to share your story with the world. But before we dive in, let me introduce my guest. Elizabeth Sharp Maketa teaches writing, including mythic memoir, for Harvard and Oxford. She is the author of 13 books, including the essay collection Awake with Assure You, and the guidebook Edit Your Life. She co-edited the anthology What Doesn't Kill Her? Women's Stories of Resilience, which Gloria Steinem described as stories that, quote, will help each of us to trust and tell our own, unquote. Elizabeth's work with myth and memoir, the focus of her PhD, has been spotlighted in Harvard Magazine and continues to guide her teaching methods. Let's welcome Elizabeth. Hi, Elizabeth. How are you today?
I'm great. I'm so happy to be here, and cheers on the beginning of the new season.
I know. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to dive right in. Can we just start with explaining mythic memoir?
Yes, Mythic Memoir is the braiding of my two favorite genres. I've always loved I've always loved myth and fairy tale because they feel like they're folk tales. They're the ultimate stories that belong to everybody, as opposed to stories that we as authors write that belong just to us. Pick a version of any Cinderella story, many Baba Yaga, Witch in the Wood stories, and each culture has a version. We could give a class a writing prompt to each write one, and we would get 15 different versions, all of which could be really interesting and flavored with each writer's individual tastes and memories and ways of speaking. I love the elasticity of these stories, and that even if we don't have a direct track to remember having read them. Even if I were to say The Red Shoes, you wouldn't necessarily think Hans Christian Andersen, Dancing to Death and Feet Cut Off, but you would have an association of you would have a feeling. You would sort of feel a glowiness around the idea of the shoes. You would sort of recognize it. So I think if I were to pick a single word for why I love myth and fairy tales, and using them in writing, it's the inclusiveness. They're stories that are innately inclusive and really, really fun to work with because of that. So there's the fairy tales, and then the memoir. I think just because each of us navigates life in the small cage of our individual first person, I find that as a reader and listener, I'm just innately biased towards someone leaning in and saying, "I." I knew, and whenever my writing students say, "Should I do second or third or first?" I don't care, it's your piece of writing. But if it's all, if it's all the same, first, you're immediately going to get your reader to lean in and say, "Oh, tell me about you. Tell me a story about you," because we all, live our first person stories, and memoirs, of course, true stories as opposed to fiction in first person. But the idea that each of us, however old or young, has a quiver of stories that have meant a lot to us and that have been part of this constellation of who we believe ourselves to be. Feels like the goods. That feels like the important stuff as we think about our lives, talk about our lives, and in terms of our conversation here, write about our lives. So those two interests have always been very important to me. And I think because I had excellent teachers in both, studied fairy tales with Maria Tatar, who's this wonderful, warm, maternal, and brilliant fairy tale scholar at Harvard. And I studied at the same time when I was 18 or 19 memoir with Hope Davis, who at the time was 95. And and I've shared with you a story, but I'll share it with your audience. When I started her writing class, I was an undergraduate and had just applied for and been rejected by every single creative writing class that my college offered, and thought, well, so I need to find a teacher somewhere. And my wonderful wise colleague suggested that I look into community education, which is now where I teach for half of my life. But that was my first foray into it. And so I signed up for a writing class taught by Hope Hale Davis. And I showed up in my, trudged through the snow, my winter coat, early January. I was 19 years old, went into the sort of bowels of an administrative building, walked down, looked at the room numbers, came to what I thought was the right room, opened the door, and it was filled with women ranging from age 70 to 95. And I looked at all these very, very old women and all of these very, very old women who were, having a laugh together. They clearly, knew each other well and were having a good time, looked back at me, and there was sort of a staring moment. And then I mumbled an apology and exited the room and checked the room number again. And it was the right room. So I went back in. And by this point, they were all laughing because they realized that I was their final classmate. And it was a group of women who had been writing together for maybe 15 years. And they brought me in as their youngest writer. And I wrote with them until the teacher died at almost 101. And so and going back to this idea of inclusive of these two genres, we all have stories about ourselves. We all have access to these folk tales. These women never once asked me to. No one ever sort of tested the legitimacy of what life's, you're writing memoir at age 19. Like, it was just assumed that, like all of them, I had stories to tell. And the idea for Mythic Memoir, even though I didn't quite put it in those words until about a decade later, when I was finishing my PhD and trying to think of a word that could describe how myth and memoir can work together, I think it really came in that class when I realized that even over the 4 years of writing with them, that even though the the surfaces of our stories were very different. One woman would be writing about making marmalade with her grandchildren, and the teacher would be writing about the New Deal and being a journalist in Washington, D.C. And I was writing about, whether or not I should marry my college boyfriend, completely different stages of life. We were all playing on these, what I now think of as these mythic threads. We were all telling stories of birth, love, and death, beginnings, connections, and ends. And I saw a real connection to the sort of bone structures of the fairy tales that I had studied, that some of these were stories of climbs. They were Jack and the Beanstalk stories and Cinderella stories. Some of these were stories of things being turned to ashes. They were, red shoe stories. They were Baba Yaga stories. Some of these involved sacrifice. Some of these involved bargain. But so many of our stories shared similar elements, and it got me thinking about what sort of molten cores of true stories that we all live, ordinary lives, can be supported and enhanced by playing in the writing process with a little bit of myth.
Yeah, I love that. So I think what my listeners are probably thinking right now is, how do I figure out what myth to use? Or do I not use a specific myth and I just pull elements of fairy tale and myth as I wish? What did you do for your writing?
So maybe I could, so what I've done is a whole mongrelly mix of all of them, but maybe I could give your readers the exercise that I give my Harvard Mythic Memoir students.
Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna do it. The so the first exercise that we do together, and it starts always as an in-class write, just so we can sort of dethrone the assignment. I think everyone here listening, and certainly you and I both know the feeling that if we sit down and say, "Okay, I've got 8 hours to get this right," the thing becomes this, like, impossible pedestaled problem. Whereas if we say, "Okay, I'm just gonna set the timer for 8 minutes. Here's my cup of tea. We'll see what happens." Then often, we spin straw into gold pretty effectively and pretty quickly. So we often And almost everything starts with an in-class write that then you can finish as homework. So the first in-class write, dear writers, is to imagine your life as a river. This is an exercise borrowed from the wonderful memoir teacher Lisa Dale Norton. Think of your life as a great river and think of the points where things change, where there's sort of the river bends, where we go from being this to being that. We go from and of course, any life has many of these. We go from a moment where we were very naive to very experienced, the sort of arc of most fairy tales. We go from a moment when we were deeply in love to out of love, or when we felt uneducated to educated. What is a moment where something changed for you, where you lived a story? And so I asked them to scrawl that out and to then identify one of those points in the great river of their life that right now feels alive to them. So think of all those river bends. You can write about them all. They're all yours. They're your story. You will live many more. And does one of them right now feel like it makes you a little curious? Like you'd like to sort of go in a little closer and ask some questions of that era? Or that's a story you'd like to tell? Or that, as one of my teachers calls it, it is not it's a story that is still in gray. You can't sort of sharply say you can't sort of sharply draw lines. It's sort of it's a there's some sort of gray that you'd like to sit through. So that might be the story to select, knowing you can do this again with any story, but pick one story, first thought, best thought, and hold on to that story for a moment. And then we'll do the next writing assignment, which is to, again, 8 minutes, refill your tea, think of a myth or a fairy tale or a very old story that you love and that you find interesting or comforting. And at this point, sometimes students who will really, they're grown-ups, all my students are adults, the average age is about 50, I think. But they want so they're here for their own purposes. They don't care if they get an A or not, but they wanna get it right. So it's usually someone will raise their hand, and it's in Zoom. They'll raise their Zoom hand and ask, "Can it be a story that isn't written down anywhere?" "My Hungarian grandmother used to tell me this story." And I'll say, "Yes, absolutely." Or they'll say someone else will raise a hand and say, with sort of a little sheepishness, "Can it be a Disney movie? Because I really like Disney's Little Mermaid, but I know those aren't very scholarly." And I'll say, "Of course. We're not about scholarship here. We're about writing. We're about using these as myths to write with." So once we've assessed that anything goes, any version goes, then I ask them to sort of pick that story that first comes to mind. It could be your dad telling you the 12 Dancing Princesses, when you were a kid. It could be watching Disney Cinderella with your godmother. It could be anything, which story that feels a familiar story that if you were to mention it among friends, people would sort of nod and say like, "Oh yeah, Little Red Riding Hood, the wolf." Everyone would have some association with this. Pick that story and then just write the 8-minute version of that story as you remember it. And pay attention both to what changes, the arc, and also to what images pop, what Gretchen Masher calls neon images. In Snow White, it might be the poisoned apple. In Baba Yaga, it might be the house on chicken feet. What are the images that just feel so wild and weird? Write those. So 8 minutes on that. So then we have some quiet in the room while everybody writes. And so by the end of the first class, people have a point of light, a story of their life that is interesting to them, and a fairy tale. And then their homework is to sort of strike sparks against each other with those 2 and ask, "What can these 2 tell each other?" Um and I give them a few tools for this, such as think about, the sort of stages of the story. In both myth and memoir, someone goes into the woods and comes out wiser. So, so how does this work? What are the stages? Maybe out your story, each of your stories. That's usually an exercise that's usually the first homework is write me an outline of each of these. So they might say, okay, in my own story, first I was at the beach with my boyfriend. Then we thought we'd take a raft out to the ocean. Then we realized we floated out to the car. Then we thought we were going to die. Then we got rescued. Okay, great. Let's line that up with what happens when the hero goes into the cave. First, there's the lion, whatever it happens to be. So usually then they have 2 outlines, and then I ask them for each of those to continue jotting down the images that feel most alive. The raft, the hot sun, the fact that there was like a fish nibbling your boyfriend's toe. What are the images? And often in this sort of wonderful magic way that this happens in writing, those will what's the verb? Coalesce,
Mm.
connect, compost, all these gorgeous C words that they'll suddenly one of them will spark something in the other, and you'll think, oh, ooh, the images of fish or food or lamp posts or fuzzy sweater. There's some image that feels suddenly enormous. So often after by the second class, we'll come back and say and feel a little bit sort of triumphant and say, this was interesting. I didn't expect much, but I learned in looking at both is that the imagery of fill in the blank. The theme of rescue was a big deal, or the imagery. A lot of the time, food comes up. I don't know why, but food is an image that I think it ties into so many of our memories. So often they'll say, "Well, I thought I was interested in the sibling relationship of Hansel and Gretel, but really it's about the gingerbread house." So they'll sort of identify something that they'll want to write. So those are the first. So that gets, and then I'll ask them, so these are your first, two in-class writes, then a homework, and then, we'll, give ourselves a round of applause for having gotten this far, for having selected the stories that we wanna think with, because as we know as writers, balancing the decision tree is often the hardest part, right? Especially with life stories, there are so many. So then I'll ask them to for their sort of first peer-reviewed exercise, to expand those 2 outlines into one maybe 10-page outline that
Mm.
includes the beginning and the turning point of climax and the end of the
Yeah.
memoir, using liberally, um, borrowing from the fairy tale. And at this point, again, the questions will come and they say, "Can I sometimes if there's a part of my story that I don't wanna tell, can I replace it with a fairy tale?"
Mm.
Yes, absolutely. Can I begin with the fairy tale and then make it clear that I'm really talking about my life? Yes, absolutely. And so they'll go through this and come back, and some pretty interesting things happen when we have the beginning and the main point and the end, which is that our story, even if we think we've just written, sort of an outline, we have most of the story if we have those 3 pieces. So then really all that's left is sort of jumping over the bridge between these continents of content. And often what happens there is that the fairy tale or myth has become, larger or smaller in how vital it is. And in some cases, really their whole memoir is a retelling of Hansel and Gretel with a few details in that make it clear that this is actually set in Texas and it's 2 sisters and there's a really creepy backstory with why they're out of the house together. This woods is not just any woods. So sometimes the fairy tale carries most of the weight. And other times the fairy tale all vanishes the way that, I think the Winston Churchill martini method where he said, "You just fill it with gin and nod toward France." Sometimes you nod toward your fairy tale and that's it.
Yeah.
So by so then the next assignment is to just fill in the draft, which is mostly complete, and by that point, it's so much easier than anybody thinks because you're just filling in, you've created most of the puzzle, you're just filling it in. And so that is, dear writers, how we would get from, no idea what we're gonna write to a draft of a mythic memoir.
Yeah, I love that. Now, in your experience, has this process of using the mythic memoir for writing your own story, has it helped the author themselves understand their story?
Hugely, and I think that might be the most generous and useful part of it, that I think that often people will either pick a story that they've told many, many times and wonder, "Why do I keep telling this?" Or a
Yeah,
story that they've never told anybody, and they wonder, "Why would I tell anybody this?"
yeah,
And I think that part of the beauty of thinking of it in terms of a myth is that a myth is a universal. A memoir is just Melody Ann, just Elizabeth, just me, just you, personal, private, sometimes embarrassing, sometimes shameful. But a myth is just this thing that, is supposed to fit on all of our lives. And that's why it's lasted for so long in so many places it's universal. So I think that is exactly what happens that when we look at and when we try to tease out the universals in these stories, we realize, "Oh, this is my version of a story that everybody loves some version of. This is my version of it. This is not bad. Does not make me anyone other than a human. So I think
Yeah.
that everyone has sort of a hey human moment. And with my Awake with Asa Shoryu, I think that was which is 11 essays, which are all some form of mythic memoir, sometimes with a very clear myth. You know, there's one that has 12 dancing princesses and sort of underground nighttime secret imagery all over it. Another's it's nod toward France, but all of them have, you know, are mostly true stories with a touch of sort of myth or magic or the liberties that make it possible to tell that story as I
Yeah.
am. And I think that I felt that I very much understood, and I think my students would all agree with this, that there's a great deal of understanding and empathy and ability to sort of exhale and let the story rest once we've seen really what it means to us and why, we've been carrying it around and how it, sort of fits into the universal fabric of stories like this that happen to people, you know, like us and not like us.
Yeah, no, I love that. Thank you. And I think that's actually a really good segue into you've written another book called Edit Your Life. And so, if if myth and fairy tale helps you understand your own life, it gives the opportunity for kind of editing your own life. So what is life editing to you?
Yes, life editing is an idea that is as simple as it sounds. It's thinking about as the protagonist of our own life, where are we now and where might we be? When I've distilled it to 2 questions before life editing is sort of, you know, 1 plus 1 is 2. It's asking, "What do I love and what fills my day,
Yeah,
and what am I gonna do about that?" And so it unlike editing a book where the question is, how do we identify what this this story most needs to be or do or say? And
yeah,
kind of clear the space for it to do that and for it to fill with what is necessary for it to do that. Life editing is working on a moving, you know, a fluid entity that doesn't end until it ends.
yeah,
So I think that, there's sort of this humble ongoing quality that any day we are alive, we can ask these simple questions of ourselves, you know, what do I need to clear more space around? And when I think that the sort of biggest, misunderstanding about any sort of editing is that it's all about throwing away. When I've explained, you know, when I first was put out the book and was talking about it, people would say things like, "Oh, I don't wanna get rid of my clothes." You know, "I don't wanna," but that's not it at all. It's about thinking what is the, you know, what best serves the sort of brightest, best version of my life, and, um, and what do we need in there? You know, what do we need to fill our time with? What do we need to fill our space with? What you know, the question of not just sort of throwing off the boat, but very deliberately bringing on the boat is a way to figure out what's necessary for this life to answer this question
yeah.
now.
And it's so interesting you say that. This what I've noticed in life is that people don't want to take anything out. We don't want to lose anything. And whether we're dieting or exercising or writing or work, we never want to take anything away because we feel we're going to lose something. And so often what I say to writers is, well, don't take anything away, just add something.
Just add
Just add a
something.
little bit. Just add a little bit. And what I find happens is when we start adding what we want, the things we don't really want just fade away. We don't have to actively say, I don't want that in my life anymore. We just have to say, what do I want in my life? Can you give us maybe like a technique or like one tip on editing our lives?
That. I love that. It's like crowding in vegetables. And I think maybe that would be the best tip is to think what is something that makes you feel most alive?
Yeah,
And is that for, you know, for people listening to this, it's probably writing. And, certainly, certainly a writer's day is better when we have written. You know, it feels a lot better, even if it's, you know, not writing for very long, not writing very well, writing and erasing it the next day. You know, any form of writing, the absolute value act of writing, helps most of us to live better in the world and love better, find more beauty. Like we are self-selected writers because we, you know, live our life better when we write.
yeah.
Pretty much fact, pretty much universal fact for most of us as writers. And so if writing is the one thing that adds that value, then, we would ask ourselves, "How do we let's put that in some form each day." And that could be a line in the journal, that could be an 8-minute writing prompt about Mythic Memoir, that could be, you know, Mad Lib and E. E. Cummings' poem. It doesn't matter. It's just sort of give yourself the fun. And I think maybe a sort of support tip to that would be take that one thing that you want to have in your day that you love and, um, and think about the end of your life, go to the end when we don't have when everything is gone, and think about the fact that the 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 fact of getting to do this, and having a life where we got to do this, even if today it feels like work or even if we've not done it for 3 months, so it feels really scary, it is a pleasure. Like that it is a fun life getting to tell stories, getting to wake up, getting we at the end
Yeah.
of the day, this is a pleasure, and so if there's a way we can make it feel like a pleasure, whether that's by getting ourselves good coffee or taking ourselves meeting a friend to do it together or buying a
Yeah.
beautiful journal, but, bringing out the pleasure of it, I think, can help something feel like it belongs in our day and it deserves to be in our day. So that would be the one thing I would say.
I love that. And you don't have to write for 4 hours to make it useful. You can write for 5 minutes, right?
Who have 4 hours?
Yeah, but a lot of people think, oh, I have to write, I should write for 4 hours, so you don't have to. And this reminds me of a story about my mom. Different story than when we were talking earlier, unfortunately, but my mother was one of the most brilliant classical pianists. She could sit down, she could play anything, and I was always amazed. And one day we were talking about it, and she said, my father hired a music teacher and said, I don't want her to write any tests. I don't want her to receive any, the grades in piano. You're like, you have to get grade 1, grade 2, and he said, I don't want any of that. I want her to play the piano for pure joy. Nothing more, nothing less, just joy. You're not here to make her a magnificent pianist. I just want her to enjoy it. And my mother didn't have any certifications around being a piano player, but I could hand her any sheet of music and she would look at it for a couple of minutes and then she would play it like a master. And so
Mm.
think about writing, if you're listening in, think about writing that way. There's
Oh,
no certification. There's no end goal. There's nothing but that momentary joy of putting pen to paper or fingers to keyboards and just finding the joy. I think that's my tip for the day.
that's
So,
so
yeah,
wise. That is so wise, and I love that story about your mother.
yeah,
That is it. We do this for fun. At the end of the day, we do this for many reasons, but we choose to do this
we do
because
it. Yeah.
it is fun.
Yeah. So Elizabeth teaches at Harvard and Oxford, and it's on Zoom. So no matter where you are in the world, you can join her. So you can learn more about Elizabeth at elizabethsharpmaketa.com. Go find her there. And I hope you've enjoyed this. Elizabeth, final last words. Anything you'd like to add?
Just how important it is that writers find other writers to be reminded of why we write and how writers help writers. Writers love writers, and whenever we get lost on the path, whenever we get stuck in the woods, often it is time with other writers or listening to another writer that can help us find our way back. So thank you for being a part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. All right. Thank you for joining us today on Author Nation Interviews, our very first episode of a season that is going to be packed with so much. You really want to come back and hear it all. I hope this conversation has provided you with valuable insights and inspiration and some practical advice to take your nonfiction writing journey where you want it to go. Don't forget to head over to authornation.online to unlock a wealth of resources. I want you to know how much I appreciate your feedback and your support. So if you've enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a comment or review, and don't forget to share it with a fellow author who might benefit, because your support helps us continue delivering the insights and the tools you need to succeed. So keep writing, keep creating, and continue sharing your unique stories with the world.